Professor Theo Venter is a political analyst, joins me now. Professor Venter, good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time tonight. Firstly, before we get into the actual details of the mission, I think what our reporter, Govan Whittles, is saying there, very important about the racism that was picked up by those that were part of the delegation. And he's explained exactly what one of our colleagues encountered. And this, of course, goes back to what Major General Wally Roeder said on Friday when they were still stuck on the tarmac, saying that part of what they were experiencing, yes, was not just based on the technical and logistical issues, but that he felt there was deliberate sabotage and racism involved in all of this.
Hi, Kathy. Yeah, I would. I think what we have learned here is the tough world of negotiations and how different people on different sides can make things very, very difficult for you. Now, we as South Africans are extremely sensitive about racism, but it is not something that is shared far beyond what we in South Africa experience. Poland, for instance, I mean, if you've got a country that is homogeneous, then suddenly the term racism is something that feels that it is that's coming from the outside. And then South Africa is there, viewed, I'm sure, by the Polish government as a government that has a very funny kind of neutrality vis-a-vis the whole situation. So I think, yes, I think there was some political intent that was brought about on us as part of the tough world of global negotiations.
So just so that I understand you clearly, Professor Venter, you're saying that what then happened and just the difficulties and the attitudes that even some of the reporters that went along on the strip experienced should not be seen solely through the lens of racism, but rather of a country that in one way or another was going to make life difficult for a country like South Africa.
Absolutely. There's no doubt. Poland is next to the Ukraine. If we look at the facts and the figures, you'll see that more than 7 million Ukrainians fled Ukraine after the Russian aggression. Most of them are still in Poland. So I think Poland is so closely associated with the conflict in their own biased way that I don't think one would expect from Poland a lot of objectivity on this one. And I think if we add to the situation shortcomings in our preparations and shortcomings in different ways of getting there, I think what we see is a mix. And then we, as South Africans, experience the way in which they dealt with us in a very sensitive way. I understand that, and I've got a lot of sympathy with that. But you must sometimes put yourself in the shoes on the other side and see why they're doing it. And it is tough, these kind of things, and you have to, and that is one of the problems I'm having with our initiative in the Ukraine and Russia. We've got wonderful negotiation technology and negotiation traditions in South Africa that took us beyond 1994. But remember, that is negotiations internally. That's within a country. Our experience as a nation with negotiations between countries and on a more global scene, it's very limited.
What about the role that South Africa has played in the region? We can talk about its success or less thereof, but I remember a time former President Thabo Mbeki playing mediator to Zimbabwe, Cyril Ramaphosa playing mediator to the conflict in Lesotho. We can stretch it to something more recent, the mediation deal that was struck in Ethiopia, Mozambique as well. So we do have a list of examples where this country has played a key role in trying to broker conflict situations. But are you saying that the experience from the region is simply not what is needed to mediate conflict in the West? And if not, Why?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. When you mediate in Southern Africa, you mediate as the major power. So you've got a certain pull, if I can call it that. If you mediate on the African continent, you've got a collective behind you, the African Union. You deal with matters with a specific mandate. When you go to something like the war in the Ukraine, then it's a completely different kettle of fish. If you look at who had the most successful intervention so far, it has been Turkey, that borders both Ukraine and Russia. It has been countries such as Israel, against all odds, that I think plays a major role in trade and trade-related issues. So you must be very careful. I think it was a very brave step from African nations to go there, but I think we must have expected a little bit more difficulty than we actually got in the end.
When we, put aside what happened in Poland, the trip itself seemed to have continued without much difficulty. The big question, of course, is the issues on the agenda, the matters that came down to the 10 points or 4 points from Russia, whichever way you want to look at it. And I think if we were to critique then what came out of that, do you not think that there was some progress? You speak to the Ukrainian ambassador, and the first thing she says is, well, we believe there's been progress from our side because President Cyril Ramaphosa is finally calling this a war, and that they're finally talking about the UN Charter and its role and the need for its principles around sovereignty and territorial integrity, for that to be protected. Is that not progress?
Oh, yeah, you have to, when you deal with these diplomatic situations, you have to read between the lines, and you have to read very sensitively about the language used. And I think in principle, there was definitely some progress. I think in principle, what the president did, our president Ramaphosa, to speak frankly to Putin about certain things that they don't agree with, that is brave on a public international stage. And I think I would compare what we have just witnessed, I would compare that to the situation when a group of intellectuals visited the ANC in Dakar in 1986. The then president of South Africa, P.W. Botha, was furious. He tried to do all kinds of things, but in the end, what happened with that negotiations, it took another 7 or 8 years to get us to 1994, but it was a certain tipping point in discussions, in talking. Now, if this delegation caused that kind of situation where the Russians can clearly see that there is definitely a different position, the Ukrainians can see that they have a similar kind of problem, then it has been progress. But I don't think we should expect from one visit like this more than exploratory discussions and more lists. I see a Chinese list of 12 points, the African Union 10 points. That's the beginning of talking.
Do you think that going forward there might be opportunity for some of the issues that perhaps might be easier to deal with? This delegation emphasized the impact of this conflict on the continent, particularly economies on the continent. And it's a very valid argument that has been made around things like the import of wheat, etc. Do you think that those kind of issues can be mediated even before this conflict is brought to an end?
Well, let me take you back again to my comparison with Dakar. The major stumbling block then was the armed struggle. And the National Party said they will not negotiate with the ANC until they cease the armed struggle. The ANC said, we will not stop the armed struggle because we don't trust the National Party government. So you have to overcome those dead ends. And here I see that the economic relations, because if you listen to Zelensky and Putin on the other side, the language that they use are not the language of somebody that is in a corner. It is the language of somebody that's still winning. Now that is very typical. But they know in their heart of hearts that they've reached certain dead ends. And I think the economic issue, the grains, South Africa need grain from Ukraine and Africa need grain from Ukraine, but we also need fertilizer from Russia. So there is a need for nations to start focusing on what is possible, and that, I think, will then provide a situation where slowly but surely the level of conflict will slowly, it will not disappear, but it will slow down. The big question here, where the armed struggle was the big question in South Africa before 1994, the big question here is, what do you do with the land that the Russians occupied, the Donetsk region? Is it going to stay or is it going back? The difficulty the Russians have, if the Donetsk region is going back, what about the Crimea, the peninsula? Wouldn't they reopen that again? So there's a lot of issues where the two sides in bilateral discussions need certain assurances. And once you have been successful in bilateral discussions, and this was exactly the design of the African delegation. They had bilaterals with Zelensky, and then they had bilaterals with Putin. And both sides have given us their position, which is more posturing than anything else. But you need to go in deeper, and I think the success of this visit will only emerge if other countries start joining it and it becomes a more collective effort.
All right. Professor Theo Venter is a political analyst. Thank you so much for your time.